Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Brought to you by NYSHEX, helping you deliver through volatility.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how's it going?
I'm doing great. I am in beautiful Athens in Greece today.
World traveler, back at it.
Oh, yeah.
That's awesome. All right, let's get started talking about rates today. And I think we wanted to do something a little different. We'll talk about the rate spreads. So, Lars, why don't you kick us off talking about the Asia North Europe rate?
Yes, just a slight preamble here. What you can see from the data is a spread, which means there's a shaded area around the index showing that at the lower limit, some of the spot rates that are the absolute lowest, what are they going for? Some of the highest, what are they going for? I don't think that's a surprise to anyone in the market. Clearly, different shippers have different deals. Obviously, the most simple one is if you're shipping one container versus if you're shipping 100,000, you obviously get different deals. So that's not really a major surprise. And of course, the spread follows the index. But what I want to focus on here is the change in the spread. Because if you look very closely here, what you will see is the spread, and that's the spread between, say, the 10 and the 90%, the 10% lowest versus the 90% highest, is actually increasing right now week on week in Asia North Europe. So we can see that one now approaching a bit over $600 in spread. It may not be all that evident when you look at it here, but if you run the math, yes, the spread has been increasing. But it's not the only trade where we are beginning to see this trend of the increasing spread. So if we switch over to one of the sub-trades over on the Pacific, we're going to be able to see it even more clearly. So what we're looking at right here is basically the China Taiwan to US West Coast. And if you look at the spread here, it actually increased quite sizably compared to last week. Maybe if you move the cursor just a tiny bit, Caroline, we can see. Yeah, because we can see even visually here how it's almost like a funnel at the end of it. We had a very, very low spread if you look back at just a month or 2 months ago, where the market was very clear for all participants what is going on. But as the spread here is now expanding rapidly, that also signals a significant amount of uncertainty in the market. Potentially in this case also linked to we're coming to the end of the usual contract negotiation. Maybe we can have a little chat about that one later. But this is not even the most extreme example of how this funnel is suddenly widening. Think if we, as the third one, shift our focus over to the Atlantic trade, a trade we're usually not covering all that much. What you can see here is usually the spread of the Atlantic is fairly sizable. But when you then look at what has happened here over the last couple of weeks, not only have spot rates increased quite significantly, you're also seeing the spread move out very significantly indeed, to the point where you have now more than $1,000 before it would difference between the 10 and the 90% cutoff. So I think that was a good visual representation of something we usually don't cover in too much depth. So not only the freight rate itself, but also the spread. So maybe in summing up what we're seeing here in the market over the last week, we've seen a market where Asia-Europe rates are declining. We're seeing a market where Pacific rates are slowly increasing. Actually, a marked jump here on the Atlantic rates. But for me, the more overall takeaway of this is the increased spread, because to me, what this signals is a market where there's a lot more uncertainty in terms of which way is the market going. And when you've got that uncertainty, of course, you also end up with spot deals that are further from each other when you look across different shippers, across different areas, than what you would normally see. So uncertainty in the market is very much the headline of what we've seen here over the past week.
Yeah. And I would imagine not everyone, or no one's surprised by the uncertainty that we're seeing here. But I think the spread is a really good indication. You know, if you're one of the smaller shippers that are looking at your rates, it's not always easy to tell based on the one index point, the price point that you're at. Being able to see the spread and how it changes over time and the magnitude is definitely a very useful insight for you. Let's talk a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz, what's happening there with the latest.
Yeah, let's do the slight caveat here that we are recording this one on Monday at 3:45 Central Europe time. The reason I put that caveat in is over the weekend, things have changed literally by the hour, and they've changed quite dramatically. So maybe just a very, very quick recap. Late Friday, just before the weekend, Iran announced that the strait was now open for everybody. And that immediately caused between 30 and 40 cargo vessels, so both tankers, bulkers, and container ships, to hoist anchor and immediately start steaming to get out of the Persian Gulf. When this Exodus Armada then reached basically the midpoint of the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranians changed their mind. They suddenly said, nope, now it's closed again, everybody do a U-turn. And almost everybody did a U-turn, and in order to really force the issue, the Iranians attacked 2, potentially 3 vessels. They had the 2 naval gunboats shooting at a tanker. We had the container vessel that were hit by either a drone or a missile, and there was an unknown splash right next to an empty cruise ship. So everybody that wanted to go out, most of them simply did a U-turn and are now back into the Persian Gulf. The Iranians have subsequently announced that only vessels that they approve will be allowed to go out, and they will prioritize vessels that came. On that basis, we are not just back to where we were before the weekend, we are back where we were 2-3 weeks ago. Because remember, over the past few weeks, we also saw Iran making deals with a few other countries. India was one of them. So, for example, Indian ships could go through. Well, the tanker that was shot at was an Indian vessel. So even those agreements are now null and void. We still see a very, very tiny trickle of vessels come out through the Persian Gulf. More than half of those are Iranian or Iranian-linked or most certainly sanctioned vessels that are coming out. That brings us up to the development we saw here Monday morning, where one of those vessels were then first hailed, then shot at, and then boarded by the U.S. forces, enforcing the blockade that they have against vessels that are either Iranian or calling Iranian ports. So for all intents and purposes, I would say the situation is much worse than where we were just a few weeks ago. Also from the perspective that this debacle with dozens of vessels having to do a U-turn and getting shot at means the next time somebody yells from the rooftops that now the Hormuz Strait is open, you're likely going to see commercial shipping lines be more hesitant in hoisting their anchors and setting sail this time around, learning from the first go-around here, which didn't work out too well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of developments happening, and the official ceasefire is set to end in the middle of this week. Is that right?
Yes. That's where the ceasefire is supposed to end. They're supposed to be meeting. The original plan was that there should be a peace talks in Pakistan again tomorrow between Iran and the U.S. At the time we are recording this, it's unclear whether that will go ahead or not. The latest messages from the Iranians are that they're not going to show up.
Yeah. All right. Well, lots happening. It'll be interesting to see what plays out this week. Let's talk about the impact that this is having on fuel, because that's definitely top of mind for everyone.
Yes. And if you look at fuel prices, especially if you look at low sulfur fuel prices, they've gone above $1,000 a ton for a while. Now the job's just slightly below. Of course, then you have the normal heavy fuel that's usually, in this case, about $200 lower. And I certainly understand why everyone is focused on the extreme hike in fuel prices. But we need to put this a little bit into context as well. Sometimes a broader perspective is also necessary. Because yes, bunker prices are extremely high right now, but they are only marginally above the whole period we saw from 2009 to 2014. We also had an extremely high fuel price when we looked back then. And this is in nominal terms. So I sat down and said, well, we need to take inflation into account. $100 today is worth a lot less than $100 worth back in 2009 to 2014. And if you take inflation into account, even with the extreme spikes here over the last 7 weeks, bunker fuel prices are nowhere near where they were that 5-year period from 2009 to 2014. We are now at a level where we are roughly at 2/3 of the level we had back then. That's not to say that the cost increase is not real. Of course, the cost increase is very real. The fuel has to be paid. But what I'm trying to say here is it is not a devastating, unmanageable event for neither carriers nor shippers, because we know factually that just 10, 15 years ago, we were happily for 5 years dealing with bunker fuel prices that in real terms were higher than what we are seeing right now. So yes, definitely a cost increase for everybody. I'm not denying that. But I just want to manage everybody's expectation that this in itself is actually not a major disaster.
Yeah. It's a good point, and I think it's a good perspective to keep in mind. You probably have shippers that would say, well, I'm seeing maybe not quite as high, but maybe I'm seeing other additional surcharges that I wouldn't have seen back then that are making the overall price higher. But it is good perspective to have in mind.
You can say when we are on the topic of those surcharges, I think it's not lost on anyone that the carriers have been busy announcing emergency fuel surcharges over the last 7 weeks. And you can say with good reason because prices went up. As we have also been discussing on previous versions of the podcast, shippers that have contracts subject to variable fuel surcharges, they will pay for these increases in Q3. It's just a time lag effect. So anybody that both has variable fuel surcharges and are paying the emergency surcharges now would de facto end up paying twice. Of course, if you don't have variable fuel surcharges, fine, you should pay higher fuel costs. And this is where the next interesting element pops up, especially if I look at the Asia to North Europe market right now. Whereas rates definitely increased during the first few weeks of the crisis, they have been coming down. And they've been coming down to a point where if I compare the spot rates in Asia and North Europe now to where we were before the war, the increase is quite small and is actually not even enough to cover the increase in fuel costs. So the carriers are clearly struggling with a market where costs have gone up, but at least on Asia and North Europe for now, a market that is not sufficiently strong for them to actually push through the full extent of these bunker surcharges.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, it's been surprising to see how tapered the price increases have been. You have this expectation when a major war breaks out, you're going to have very high increases in rates. But yeah, what we've generally been seeing is not that high of a rate increase, especially if we're comparing to the beginning of the trade war last year and into the summer. So it's an interesting point to keep in mind that the carriers aren't necessarily recovering on the costs that they're now having to outlay given everything that's happening. All right, and then we had one more thing to talk about today. So consumer spending. Could you talk about the latest report that you came across?
Yeah, consumer confidence rather than spending. Of course, there are many different measurements out there. One of the ones has been around a long time, and I think anybody who has seen me over the years know I'm a great fan of very long time series again, to lend some perspective whether something is really extreme or not. But the University of Michigan in the US has been measuring consumer sentiment for the last 66 years. They started that data series all the way back in 1960. And of course, that has been seeing a lot of ups and downs over the years. The latest measurement they came out with was a new record low. So let's just everybody pause for a second and think that one through. If you think of all the events that had beset the US over the last 66 years, since 1960, the current situation has caused the lowest level of consumer sentiment that we have seen. That is not a good sign. Before everybody jumps out a window and say, oh my God, the economy will crash imminently, well, let's play that one a little cool as well. Because even though now is indeed a record low, the consumer sentiment has been exceedingly low for several months already. So it's not that it comes completely out of the blue. And despite that very low consumer confidence, American consumer spending has thus far actually held up pretty nicely. So we are in the situation de facto right now where at least all the macro numbers are showing us US consumer spending is still holding up, but at the same time, the consumers are more worried than at least in the last 2 to 3 generations we've seen since 1960. That should be at least a worrying sign in terms of what we might see also on the shipping side, where of course, whenever consumer spending in the US goes either up or down, that has an almost immediate impact on container volumes as well.
Yeah, it'd be hard to quantify something like this, but I wonder how much of that consumer sentiment is fed by what you see on social media, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and all the exposure to world news that generally makes people feel a bit more concerned and less confident in where the economy is going. I wonder if that's a factor in this.
It definitely could be a valid factor, especially because in this day and age of social media algorithms, bad news just tend to trend a lot better than positive news.
Yeah. Well, interesting stuff. I know we also talk about consumer demand. So these are telling the same story, basically, with the demand decreasing, at least out of the U.S. And then we're also seeing downtrending sentiment.
Yeah,
So.
we've seen downtrend in container volumes, at least ever since the trade war began since April.
Right. All right, Lars, anything else you want to add for today's episode?
No, I think that should be enough for everybody. Again, in the spirit of not just launching all sorts of problems and bad news, I will still reiterate what we also talked about a week ago. Container demand globally is actually doing phenomenally well. Most economies are booming. Growth rates are high. So, yes, we can focus on where the problems are, because that's usually where people should spend their time and saying, what should we do differently? That doesn't mean that everything is horrible everywhere, because actually it is not.
Yeah. It's always good to end on a positive note. Thank you for that, Lars. All right. We'll be back next week with another episode. I hope everyone has an awesome week. If you haven't subscribed already, we are on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. So give us a listen and a subscribe if you like us. We'll talk to you next week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NiceX. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.